Hi there, I'm Pete Scargill. The purpose of this video is to show you a little bit about JavaScript, about a particular aspect encapsulating your code, and I'm going to explain why you might want to do that and why I did it. Two reasons for producing this video. One is to clarify it in my own head, and the second is hopefully to give you a bit of an insight into an aspect of JavaScript that kept me going for a little while. Anyway, first of all, I'll show you my application, and then you might see why I was interested in what I'm going to show you. So first of all, let's have a quick look at this. This is a JavaScript gauge using HTML5 canvas that I've designed for Node-RED. It's to be a little block in Node-RED. It's totally programmable. You have two needles here which you can turn on and off. You have a display you can turn on and off. You have flashing indicators you can turn on and off. You have an arc you can turn on and off. You can control the numbering here. I've got it from -10 to 100. So it's a totally programmable gauge, and it has animation. So over on the right off screen here, I have a Node-RED page up with some controls I'm going to press to show you what I mean. Now let's take the value of gauge 1. There you go. Press the button and all on its own, it will move up and down, back down to 10 degrees. Meanwhile, I can take needle 2 up and down. I can change those set points, and I can change the text in the LCD display. Right, so as you can imagine, a fair bit of code to achieve that. And as I was writing the code and deciding what variables to make available to people, I realized that I was ending up with an awful mess. And if I wanted more than one gauge, then there was going to be interaction between variables. So one of the things you can do in JavaScript is encapsulate things, if you like, in objects. And well, I've just totally avoided that up to now. And so late last week, towards the weekend, I decided to stop what I was doing and learn. And I asked a few people, and I didn't get an awful lot of answers. And so I went on to my friend Google and figured it out. I'm quite pleased, and so I'm going to show you the basics of what I've learned, and hopefully you'll be able to make use of it as well. And what I'm going to show you is nothing more than this. This is a live CodePen. You can see codepen.io. You can also see an address there, which you're welcome to go and click on and have a play with if you want. So what are we looking at? Well, half of what we're looking at here wouldn't normally be there. So for example, to make life easy to put something into the HTML area down here at the bottom, I've used jQuery for no other reason than that. So that's the reason for this include in the HTML area. To make that number 5 easily visible to you, I have put a font size in there. That's the only reason I've done that. So the interesting bit, I guess, is the div. That is the place that holds my number 5. And in my gauge, I hold a couple of canvases. Now, just before you ask why a couple of canvases, well, there's stuff on that gauge that is drawn once only, and there's stuff on that gauge that changes in time. So I decided I'd separate them out after discovering that you can indeed put one canvas on top of another in HTML5, and that they are indeed transparent. That was another learning exercise all of its own. So, encapsulating. I'm going to show you something here, and you're going to see a result in this window down at the bottom. And it's all very simple. But let me just take you through this code on the right. If I do my job properly, you'll thoroughly understand it in a very short length of time. If I wanted to put the number 5 down there, I could simply use this one-liner. Hashfred, that is in jQuery the ID Fred, which is down here. Make the inner HTML a value, which in this case is 5. Just bear with me a second and we'll go through why that looks like that later. But this is an example of what I'm showing you here can be expanded almost indefinitely. What I've made is a definition of stuff that I can manipulate, like for example my gauge. Here I've created an instance of that called Brian, and I've initialized Brian. So let me take you through that. This bit here, this first line and that last line, everything in there, unless I say otherwise, is private. It's hidden away, belongs to that definition. You'll notice the word this. The importance of this is Brian down here is an instance of my object, but I could have two of them. I could have Ian. I don't want them interacting. So in this case, this refers to information in each instance. So V1 in Brian is not the same as V1 in Ian. They are separate. So back to the gauge, I can have two gauges on the same page. Lovely. So what I was trying to achieve was wrap everything in a box and just bring out what I needed, like setting needles and that kind of thing. As I interact with this code on the right, you will see that the number 5 there, or whatever ends up there, will change dynamically. That's a wonderful feature of CodePen. It's great for playing around with. Brian is now this new object, and it has functions that we can use called methods. One of them is init. Now, why have I called it this init? Well, this allows me to access outside of that box functions and variables inside. So for example, if we take this away, sorry, it doesn't work because init is a private function internal to the object. By simply adding this, I make it available externally. So immediately you can see you can hide a load of variables and functions away in there. There's no chance of anybody messing about with them. And you can bring out the ones that are actually useful. And you'll see an example of that in this tiny little demo. You'll see an example of that shortly. So this init is a function. And what does it do? Well, it sets this v1 to value 5. And then it sets an interval timer which calls a function test. It reoccurs every 25 milliseconds and it passes this. Don't get hung up on that, why I'm doing that yet. I'll explain that in a minute. I have another public function called doubleIt, which takes this v1 and multiplies it by the argument in the function. So see down here, comment Brian doubleIt 12. All of a sudden we have 24 there, because that's the last function. It's overriding what I had before. Get rid of it, we go back to 5. Now remember what I said about variables that I wanted to expose to the outside world? I've referred to v1 as this v1 as against just v1, which would be an internal function. So therefore I can also pull a stunt like this. Brian v1 equals 3.1415, and there it is. So I can access a variable inside Brian. So we have an external function called init, and we have an external function called doubleIt. I believe these are referred to as methods rather than functions. I just call them functions because that's what I'm used to. I also mentioned that after init, there was a function called test running every 25 milliseconds and being called this. Why every 25 milliseconds? Well, it's of no relevance at all here, but when you saw my little gauge whizzing up and down, that's how I did it. Test is a function. I'm passing a parameter to it. I'm going to pass it into something called local this. It's just a word. Could be Peter, Paul, doesn't matter. You'll see why in a minute why I'm doing that. So then I'm saying, okay, well, I want you to, every 25 milliseconds, update that display down there in Fred with local this v1. Why local this v1? Surely we're talking about this v1. Oh, it's just disappeared. How about v1? Nope, there isn't one of those either. I learned this the hard way. Although anything in here is covered by this, that function isn't actually running inside here, is it? Every 25 milliseconds, long after we've finished setting this up, this is running all on its own. So it's this is inside here. So that's no good to me. That particular this.v1, I could have one. I could say this v1 equals 8. Notice that's still 5. This v1 is 8. Right? So how could I make sure I pass this to that function? I've seen a number of ways of doing this. You can make a global and pass it, but that's messy. I'd rather just somehow pass that across. And that's exactly what I did with local this. How did I come to that conclusion? Well, it seems in JavaScript you can pass pretty much anything. Objects, functions, anything. So I just tried it and it worked. So there it is. We have a function here which knows about that variable. That variable is public, so we can access it either directly or via some function. Take all of this, hide it away and include, and you've written a piece of code, and all the end user needs to worry about are the bits that you want them to see. Now, if I can show you something here, where I'm messing around with this code, let me show you why I would want to hide the code for the gauge. Well, because it starts there and it goes all the way down there and all the way down there, and it just looks horrifying because there's lots of it. And yet all the end user sees is this. For gauge 1 is a new gauge. Initialize the gauge. I've got some stuff commented out here. See those two buttons there? Those two little round things? They are set indicators. Enable set to is false. And lo and behold, one of them disappears. Flashing. Flashing equals false. No flashing anymore. This is still a work in progress, as you can see, but basically I can expose as much or as little to the end user who's going to use my gauge to make life really simple for them, and they really don't need to know about all that complexity unless they want to go in and make some changes. They can just use, and surely that's the whole point of modern programming, you can produce a block for somebody and say, there you go. So all of that has escaped me until recently, and then just with this little bit of experimenting, it all became clear. And I hope it's clearer to you, and I hope you will have a play with this piece of code so that you become familiar with the idea and you can go off and use it for whatever you want. Hope you enjoyed that. If it was as clear as mud, let me know.